They said my silence was weakness, that a princess should know how to speak with firmness, command with clarity, dominate with words. But no one ever taught me what to do when the heart speaks louder than the voice and still needs to stay quiet. My name is Mayara. I was born into a noble lineage, surrounded by inherited expectations, imaginary thrones, and promises made in my name without my consent. I was raised among gilded mirrors and cutting remarks, as if every detail of me had to reflect the perfect image of someone I never had the chance to become. I grew up with ladies-in-waiting and tutors who corrected even the way I breathed. I learned to smile silently in the face of polite lies, to hold back tears with my spine straight, to accept that my fate was already sealed, and that the only choice available was to obey with elegance. Inside me, something burned, a scream, muffled by layers of velvet and rules. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't whole either. I was molded to please, to serve, to never feel more than what was permitted. Then amidst one ceremony or another, where I was more symbol than person, he appeared. Not with pomp, nor with reverence, but with a presence as discreet as it was solid. He wasn't a man of the court. He wore no medals, carried no revered surnames. He was someone out of place in that space, and perhaps that's why he caught my attention. He didn't try to approach me, he didn't court me, he simply looked at me, but not like the others. His gaze didn't strip me of my nobility. It gave me back the humanity I didn't even know I'd lost. And in that brief, contained, silent moment, I felt free. Not like someone escaping, but like someone finally seen. Not as a princess, but as a woman. I returned to my routine that same day, and no one noticed that something had changed. My dresses remained impeccable, my posture still flawless, my voice still sweet and measured. But inside me, there was a new echo, the echo of a gaze that demanded nothing, only recognized. And so, without a name, without touch, without words, I began to surrender, not out of impulse, but out of discovery, the most silent of all. It started with small deviations, almost imperceptible, but to me, they carried the weight of revolutions. A slower step on the balcony when I knew he'd be passing by. A book left open to a passage about freedom, hoping he'd see it. A glance cast over a goblet during a dinner, long enough to be noticed but short enough not to be reproached. No, one around me noticed, but my entire world was shifting with delicacy. I was living a love that grew like dew, silent, almost invisible, but real. And in that silence, there was everything I'd never dared to say. He responded too, in his own way, a subtle nod from a distance. The way he lingered longer at the edges of ceremonies. The way he lowered his gaze when our eyes met, not out of submission, but out of respect. With every restrained gesture, he told me, "I'm here, I see you." And that was enough. I didn't need words. I never did. Because what bloomed between us was older than conventions and stronger than prohibitions. It was pure feeling, and for that reason so dangerous. There was a day when I almost went too far. A court celebration, a formal dance, and at the end, a chance to be alone for a few minutes in the garden that separated the halls from the stables. I knew he'd be there, and he was. We stood face to face, close enough to hear each other's breathing, far enough not to draw attention. No one spoke, but our eyes carried centuries. And in that moment I wanted to reach out, to touch his face, to say that my heart no longer belonged to me. But I didn't. Instead, I looked away. I returned to the hall, and I left behind the only place where I could breathe. From that day on, I understood what it meant to love in silence. It wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the decision not to let it explode, when everything around wanted to contain it. And even without words, even without touch, I was already surrendered, because there are ways of loving that don't need a stage. They only need courage. The silence that was once a prison became a refuge. I began to live in a kind of parallel reality, one where love wasn't spoken but inhabited. While the world around me revolved around alliances, protocols, and traditions, I built, stone by stone, an invisible castle where he and I existed. No one knew. No one needed to know. Because every gesture of his, however discreet, was an answer to what my heart was already shouting inside. A flower left on the greenhouse bench where I used to walk alone. A handkerchief folded with care left on the chair I often occupied. He read me. He understood me. And I felt him, even without having him. But the world of royalty is blind to what is subtle. And as much as we tried to hide, the court's eyes began to sniff out something off script. The veiled questions came. The conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The invitations that stopped being delivered. And in the background, my mother's gaze, inquisitive, anxious, as if she sensed something in me had slipped from her grasp, and it had, just not in the way she feared. I wasn't rebelling with words or overt actions. I was simply loving, in silence, in secret, in depth. And no one knew how to handle that. He, sensing the growing tension around us, began to pull away. It was subtle, as everything about him was. He started walking different routes. He avoided meeting my gaze at events, and that tore me apart more than any direct confrontation. Because it wasn't rejection, it was protection. He was trying to spare me, but I was already committed, I was already his, and that distance, even silent, even respectful, hurt like an absence the body feels, even when surrounded by everything. Yet it was in that increasingly heavy silence that I understood something that changed everything. My surrender didn't depend on his presence. I had already chosen. And that choice, even without announcement, even without celebration, had already shaped who I was. I was no longer just the princess who knew how to smile with grace and speak with sweetness. I was the woman who, for the first time, dared to love with her own soul, and sustained that love alone, even when everything seemed to crumble, and so ended that first act, without scandals, without hidden kisses, without declarations, but with a silent certainty that no decree could undo. My heart already had a name, and it answered to that man who dared to love me, without saying a single word. His distance became my new routine, and yet I never felt so connected to someone. I didn't need to see him to feel him. It was enough to walk through the corridors he'd passed, to touch the objects his hands had moved, to breathe the same air of the mornings he used to contemplate in silence. It was as if he'd left pieces of himself scattered everywhere, discreet, quiet, but alive. There was love there. Love in the way he withdrew to protect me. Love in the chosen absence. Love in the silence that screamed inside me every time I looked for him and didn't find him. And still, I understood. And because I understood, I loved him even more, but others didn't understand. The court's gazes turned into blades. Questions became whispered accusations. A counselor told me, in a paternalistic tone, that a princess must not let herself be disturbed by fantasies. Fantasies. That was the word they used for the truest feeling I'd ever carried in my chest. I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, but because I'd learned that sometimes silence holds more dignity than any explanation. I continued loving in silence, with the same resolve with which I wore my crown. And to my surprise, he continued too. I knew. I felt it. Sometimes walking through the gardens in the late afternoons, I'd find an object out of place, a trail of freshly disturbed leaves, a flower deliberately turned upside down. Small signs only I would notice. Small signs that said, "I'm here, I'm still yours." At a public event, our paths crossed again. I felt his presence before I saw him. It was as if the air changed density. When I finally looked at him, there he was, standing among the others, discreet but whole. And for a moment the world vanished. The suspended time between us wasn't made of words, but of everything we'd already said with our eyes, our gestures, our waiting. And as I passed by him, I didn't stop. I didn't smile, but I let a single petal fall from the flower I held, and it landed at his feet. In that moment I realized I didn't need a touch to know I was loved. I didn't need a kiss to know I belonged to someone, because what bound us didn't unravel with absence, and what I felt was already stronger than any declaration could contain. The petal at his feet was the only declaration I dared to make, and it was everything. Because the moment it touched the ground, I felt with the certainty of someone who's lived 1,000 lives that he understood. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that simple gesture carried all the words I'd never say aloud. It was my way of staying, of saying, I haven't pulled away, even if the world forces us to walk apart. But the world, as always, isn't content with silences. Politics imposed itself like a wall before me. My days began to fill with meetings and intentions of alliances, with noble families who barely knew how to pronounce my name. One in particular was chosen with enthusiasm by the councillors and my mother. A man with a well-sculpted face, a respected name, but a heart as empty as the halls where I pretended to be happy. He offered me gifts, memorized verses, promises. That didn't touch me. I smiled. Inside I died. Because he spoke of power, titles, appearances. But none of his speeches had the delicacy of a gesture from Elijah, the man without pomp but with soul. The only one who saw me when no one else knew where I was. They began to pressure me, first with subtle praise for the convenience of the union, then with veiled warnings, finally with clear threats that if I didn't accept, I'd jeopardize the kingdom's image. They looked at me as if I were a gold coin, valuable but silent, a piece to be used in the grand chessboard. And there, amid those sharp voices, I realized that my silent surrender to love was a risk they couldn't allow, and that I could no longer hide. Even without words, my heart was exposed, and the world around me was preparing to crush it. Spent sleepless nights, not out of fear of the court, but out of fear of hurting him. I knew that he, more than anyone, feared being the cause of my pain, that if he knew of the pressures, he'd retreat even further, disappear completely. And yet, in the midst of that storm, he remained, invisible to others' eyes, but present in me in every way. He kept leaving small signs of his existence. A page turned in a book only I read, a clean bench in a garden no one else sat on. And every time I noticed, it was as if he said, "Don't forget who you are." And I didn't forget. Even surrounded by demands, even suffocated by nobility, I still knew, because my surrender wasn't a thoughtless choice. It was the most intimate decision I'd ever made. And now, even if the court dragged me away, even if they wanted to bury everything under golden alliances, there was something they couldn't undo. I was already his, entirely. And in silence, I would fight to keep being. The engagement ceremony was scheduled without my consent, a date stamped on invitations that bore my name without carrying my will. The news spread like wildfire. Princess Mayara at last will be betrothed. That's what they wanted to see. A molded woman, surrendered to the crown's fate, marching silently to a political altar. What they didn't know was that my silence was no longer submission. It was resistance. In the days leading up to, The public announcement, loneliness wrapped around me like a heavy veil. I walked the palace corridors as if crossing a living tomb. I ate little, slept less, and smiled not at all. I was becoming more transparent, even to myself. And on one of those empty mornings, I went to the garden where we used to see each other without ever meeting. The air was cold, the sky too clear, and there he was, standing as if he knew I'd come, as if somehow his heart still beat in sync with mine. We didn't touch, we didn't speak, but our eyes, oh, our eyes, they said everything the world tried to erase. And for the first time, I saw sadness in his. Not guilt, not weakness, but the pain of someone who loves so much they'd rather leave than see me broken. And that's when I understood. If I accepted that engagement, I wouldn't just betray myself. I'd betray everything we'd lived, every silent gesture, every silence filled with meaning, every part of me that had been given little by little, with such care. That night I wrote a letter to the consul. I didn't use fiery words or threats. I simply stated with gentle firmness that I wouldn't accept the union. Not because I'd fallen for a commoner, but because I'd already made a choice, an intimate, indestructible mine. I didn't need to say his name, nor explain my heart. I ended with the only sentence I had left. A princess may be silenced by laws, but she'll never be mute before love. The scandal was immediate. There were meetings, reprimands, looks of disappointment. They tried to convince me, pressure me, warn me, but it was too late. What was inside me could no longer be contained. I had surrendered in silence. But now, even silent, my stance spoke for me, and no one could force me to be what I wasn't anymore. The next morning I returned to the garden. He wasn't there, but on the bench where we used to exchange absences, there was a single white rosebud, and beneath it a folded note in handwriting I'd recognize among thousands. You never needed to shout to make me stay. And so ended the second act, not with fireworks, nor with applause, but with two hearts that even in silence chose to remain in each other against all odds. The court never declared it aloud, but something shifted after my refusal. I wasn't exiled. I wasn't stripped of my title. I simply became less present in meetings, less requested in decisions, less remembered in official ceremonies. It was the price for choosing my heart over strategy. They erased me little by little, the way candles are snuffed out in a hall when the show is over. And yet, I continued, in peace, because that invisibility gave me the freedom I'd always longed for. For the first time, I was my own. I began to live on the margins of grand events, but at the center of my own story. I walked more through the gardens, wrote letters I never sent, read books once forbidden for distracting from politics. And in that retreat, I discovered that the absence of obligations was fertile ground for feeling and for loving without haste. He returned little by little, discreet as always, but more present. He sat on the bench a few steps from where I walked. Sometimes he brought simple bread, left beside a statuette. Other times he stayed quiet, just breathing the same air as me. We no longer needed to pretend we didn't see each other. There was nothing left to hide. The world had silenced us, and without knowing, given us the perfect space to bloom. People began to notice, not with scandal but with curiosity. Some approached cautiously, as if trying to understand how a princess, without a ring or a husband, could seem so serene. Others whispered as always, and soon gave up for lack of anything to exploit. There was no scandal, there was no fall, just two beings who had chosen to walk side by side, without contracts, without formal promises, only with presence, with truth. And in that calm, I found something deeper than any rain, real life. the kind that pulses beyond the halls, that grows between hands, that listens to the sound of the world instead of a throne's orders. I discovered it was possible to reign over oneself, that my greatest crown was my silence, not as submission, but as strength, the strength of someone who chose to love without making noise, and was still heard by the one who truly mattered. Time passed with the gentleness of someone who needs to prove nothing, and with it, my position in the court transformed quietly. I was no longer the princess present in political decisions, nor the centerpiece of official events, but I became something else, a respected enigma. They began to look at me with more caution, almost reverence, not because they feared me again, but because they realized that even without raising my voice, I stood firm, unshakable, and that has a power even the highest titles can't mimic. My love for him no longer needed to hide, but it also never needed to be displayed. We continued living our lives intertwined on the margins of events. He in his silence, I in my space of freedom. We shared simple mornings, afternoons walking side by side through the avenues, and nights when the sound of crickets and the breeze were enough for everything to feel complete. There was no formal proposal, no rings, no witnessed vows, just the silent understanding that belonging is stronger than possessing. And I belonged to him with every gesture I didn't need to announce. But life, with its firm way of testing all that is true, brought us a choice. A marriage proposal arrived from abroad, not to me, but to the crown. It was a chance to unite kingdoms, strengthen alliances, restore my family's prestige, an opportunity that, in other times, would have been celebrated as divine providence. And even after everything, they expected me to accept, not for love, but for duty, as if I could be torn from my truce for the sake of borrowed glory. The response came, as always, in silence. But this time, a silence laden with action. I didn't send a letter. I didn't give justifications. I simply went to the court's assembly, sat among them as I once did, and placed on the table the ring they'd sent me. I stood without uttering a single word, and I left. That night, he was waiting for me in the garden. He didn't ask anything. He didn't celebrate. He just extended his hand and led me to our usual bench. And as we sat there, under the silent stars, I realized there was nothing left between us that needed to be said. The choice had already been made, and not out of impulse, but out of fidelity to everything we were since that first glance. The love we built never needed witnesses to be real, but over time, even those who didn't understand began to recognize the strength of what existed between us. Not because we declared it, we never did, but because it was etched in every detail of our coexistence, in the way he waited for me in silence, in the care with which he prepared life's simple things, in the absolute respect he always offered me. The world can doubt many things, but it doesn't doubt what is constant, and we were constancy, a solid presence in a world that thrives on spectacle and appearances. Over the years, our love took root serenely. There were no grand turnarounds, no romantic explosions, just a steady construction made of daily gestures, attentive glances, shared silences. People began to seek us out not to judge, but to listen. Young courtiers, tired of rigid rules, came to hear what we thought. Women of all ages approached seeking refuge in my story, not because it was grandiose, but because it was true. And I told them, you don't need to shout to be heard, you only need to live with clarity and stay with courage. On a calm morning, as we walked together as we always did, he stopped beside me and just looked at me. He said nothing, and I understood. Time had passed kindly, but now it weighed on his shoulders. He was slower, quieter, and still full of the same light that touched me from that first moment. We cared for each other like tending an ancient garden, with patience, reverence, and steady hands. When he fell ill, I refused the medicines they wanted to force on him, the treatments that would strip him of dignity. I stayed with him until the end, by his bedside, holding his hand as he had held mine so many times, without needing to say anything. He left on a spring afternoon, with the sun filtering through the leaves like liquid gold. We didn't cry. We didn't fear. I simply let his hand slip from mine when his breathing stopped, and in that moment a deep peace enveloped me, because he was loved until the end, in silence, with fullness, and with surrender. Today, I sit every day on the same bench where it all began. I stay there listening to the wind, feeling his presence in everything around me. I never married. I never wore a veil, nor walked down an aisle. But I loved more deeply than many who vowed aloud and forgot the next month. My love was whole. It was choice. It was constant. And even now, when they ask why I never declared my love publicly, I just smile. Because those who love with truth don't need to say. They show. And I showed. In every silence, in every gesture, in every time I chose to stay. Today, they say I was the princess who never married, who never declared her love, who never scandalized the court with forbidden romances. But there's something few understand. I loved with such wholeness that I didn't need public vows or crowns of flowers. The love that lived in me was subtle as dew, firm as ancient roots, and eternal as all that is silent and true. The garden bench is still there. Sometimes young people sit there and ask if it's true that a love story began there. I just smile. Because some stories don't need to be told. You just feel them in the air, in the leaves, in the memory of the wind. And so I go on, not as a princess forgotten by history, but as a woman who one day surrendered to love in silence and never regretted it.